Barack Obama vows to finish the job in Afghanistan as he prepares to roll out his new war strategy. Can a military solution still work? And is the Afghan political scene conducive to a new American plan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, Barack Obama says he's determined to finish the job in Afghanistan. The US president has spent months pondering his next move for the 80-year-old war that is increasingly unpopular with the American public. Well, he's offered a preview of his new strategy in Afghanistan, which is set to unveil next week. Rosalind Jordan reports from Washington.
With the ninth and final meeting of his national security team now over,
the President of the United States.
President Barack Obama said on Tuesday he will soon tell the U.S. public, and indeed the world, what he plans to do about the 8-year-long war in Afghanistan.
It is in our strategic interest, in our national security interest, to make sure that al-Qaeda and its extremist allies cannot operate effectively in those areas. We are going to dismantle and degrade their capabilities and ultimately dismantle and destroy their networks. And Afghanistan's stability is important to that process.
The announcement is likely to come as early as next week, but Obama would not give details of his decision, which he has been debating with aides for several months. However, numerous press reports suggest the president will approve sending between 32 and 35,000 additional soldiers and Marines to join the 68,000 already deployed. The top general in country, Stanley McChrystal, and the U.S. ambassador, Carl Eikenberry, are reportedly preparing to sell the plan to Congress next week. And it's thought Obama's plan will include decision points for adding or withdrawing U.S. forces based on the current security situation. Obama suggested he would spell out the process to get more Afghan security forces trained and deployed across the country.
Provide security on this route here.
And he also suggested that the U.S. will spend time trying to persuade other members of NATO to deploy more troops of their own in order for the mission to succeed.
If we can get more of it, that would help us, because obviously we do have some forces that are now doing some work in the north. And this would allow us to sort of focus all of our efforts in the south, or much more of our efforts in the south, which seems to be the hotbed of Taliban activity lately.
The months of deliberations have taken a toll on Obama's approval ratings. They're now around 50%. There's also grumbling that the added troops could add billions in additional expense while the economy is still weak. But the president said the public would appreciate the time he and his advisors have put into making the decision.
I feel very confident that when the American people hear a clear rationale for what we're doing there and how we intend to achieve our goals, that they will be supportive.
Obama's announcement will come at a difficult moment. Next week, the U.S. Senate is slated to start debate on his top domestic policy, health care reform. And it's not clear whether Obama has enough political capital at the end of his first year in office to get both health care reform and the support he'll need for the war in Afghanistan. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Kabul, Daoud Sultanzoy. He's an independent member of the Afghan parliament. In New York, Michael Cohen, a senior research fellow at the New America Foundation. And in Washington, D.C., Carolyn Wadhams. She's a national security policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. Thank you all for joining us. Let's start with Michael. Is a troop increase the solution?
Well, I mean, apparently that seems to be the view in the White House.
But is it your view?
More troops needed to stabilize. My view is probably not. I think that what we've seen in the last couple of months with the problems with the Afghan government, with the continued presence of Afghan Taliban safe havens in Pakistan, that the situation in Afghanistan is one that is not conducive necessarily to a more robust counterinsurgency
But
operation.
Defenders of the plan might argue that's the whole point, sending more troops so that perhaps the domestic situation can be focused on and can be fixed and repaired amidst all the extra security.
Well, sure, but of course, classic counterinsurgency doctrine tells us that for a counterinsurgency to succeed, you really need to have the support of a host country government, which I'm not sure that we have in Afghanistan. I'm hoping that when the president announces his plan next week, he'll make clear what kind of benchmarks are going to be put in place to ensure that the Afghan government steps up and actually cracks down on corruption, provides capacity to actually help the counterinsurgency effort. If you don't have those benchmarks in place and a clear sense of what you need to do to keep the mission going, I'm not sure how it's going to succeed.
All right, let's take some of those points to Karen. And of course, we could talk a lot about the domestic situation in Afghanistan, which I do want to do in a moment. But first, I want to put this question to you. What is different from some of the classic counterinsurgency strategies that have been tested and, frankly, failed in the past?
What is the difference between this strategy and previous ones?
Yes, of course, from what we know of this strategy so far, I should say.
Well, one of the problems, I think, with the current counterinsurgency strategy that President Obama looks like he wants to undertake is that we have far too few troops to actually do a counterinsurgency strategy, and we would never have the troops that would be required anyway. You would need, if you were going to do a classic counterinsurgency strategy, you would need about 400,000 troops. That's never going to happen.
So is it a case of neither here nor there? I mean, how do you feel about what we're hearing, at least, of this strategy?
Well, I think that my feeling is that troop levels are not going to solve the problem. If they're not embedded within a much larger political and diplomatic strategy that actually address the sources of the insurgency, then it's never going to succeed. I mean, we're talking about President Obama looks like he might send another 35,000 troops. This is not going to be the answer. You have to look at some of the other issues, such as the lack of justice, which has driven people into the arms of the insurgency, the corruption that people perceive that the Afghan government is corrupt and predatory. You have to deal with that issue, and also NATO missteps, which have been hugely problematic. The civilian casualties that we have that have occurred, that we've been responsible for, as well as terrible detainee policies that we've been responsible for. All of these issues need to be addressed.
All right, we've got two views from the US. Let's go to the Afghan capital, Kabul. What is the sense in Afghanistan? Is there some expectation, perhaps, that the increase in the number of troops might actually lead to an improvement in the lives of Afghans?
I think the increase in troops alone will not fix all the problems that we are facing. It will raise a lot of expectation because increase in troop would mean more U.S. involvement and a larger military footprint, which in turn will increase the expectation of the people of Afghanistan in terms of United States' ability to deliver. But in all of this, the United States, I've been arguing this for several years, that the United States is missing the counterpart that it needs in Afghanistan, which is an effective government in Afghanistan. And the international community and the people of Afghanistan in this thing are on the same side. But the international community and the United States have not been able to approach and directly appeal to the people of the country. They have had a very inadequate conduit, which was the government of Afghanistan, that was playing the role of a conduit between the international community and the people of Afghanistan. And now the international community can put the pressure on the government of Afghanistan.
Supporters of that process would argue that they did have elections. Karzai was voted into office at least the first time. Not so sure about what happened the last time. What is the alternative to that?
I think the alternative is not to give up, first of all. That has to be something that we all have to keep in mind. And the United States public opinion in this case, because we're talking about U.S. troops.
Practical steps, Dawood, if I could push you on that. What is the
practical
that's a good
steps
slogan,
are
don't give
to
up.
put
But
pressure.
I mean, you're in a political deadlock right now in Afghanistan. What is the alternative to Karzai?
Well, the practical steps are initially, right now, we have to put the pressure on the government and Karzai to deliver a cabinet that is a cabinet that can deliver. And if that cannot be achieved, then we have to appeal to the people of Afghanistan, ask for a grand assembly and create a transitional government that will just adhere to the rule of law and work with the international community to re-engage the people of Afghanistan. In all of this, the most important thing is to re-engage the people of Afghanistan, and we need to keep that in mind. And this government is not the word of God. If it doesn't work, the people of Afghanistan has to get rid of this government.
All right, let's go to Michael once again. How realistic is it, the sort of expectation that a little bit more pressure on Karzai, he can put together a good cabinet and he can get rid of corruption?
I mean, that's the question, obviously, and I'm not so sure it's realistic. I mean, you have seen very little evidence to date that the Karzai government is serious about cracking down on corruption and is serious about taking the steps necessary to support a counterinsurgency effort. And to some extent, you know, you're sort of asking the American people to put good money after bad. As Carolyn pointed out, and I think she's absolutely right about this, 30,000 troops is not going to allow us to fight a real counterinsurgency. The way for this to succeed relies on two things. First, it relies on the Karzai government taking the steps necessary that they need to take on corruption, on capacity, on supporting the U.S. military effort. And second, it relies on the Pakistani government cracking down on Afghan Taliban safe havens in Pakistan. Okay, there's not a clear sense of how you're going to get to that point. And what I think people need to look for in President's speech on Tuesday is how he wants to accomplish those two goals.
Isn't there something of a contradiction there, or
you're not going to make
between
progress.
those two goals? On the one hand, the U.S. telling the Afghan government that their support is not open-ended, but at the same time, you want to tell the Pakistanis that you're in this fight for the long haul. There's no coming out of it until victory.
Well, I mean, I think the contradiction, in some extent, is actually telling the Karzai government, we want you to take all these steps, but we're not going to stop sending troops and put them into harm's way. We're going to increase our commitment over the next year or 2 years, at the same time that we're going to demand that you make these changes with no guarantee that you're going to make them. From the Pakistanis' perspective, I think it's up to the U.S. government to make clear why it's in their interest to crack down the Afghan Taliban. And I think that's going to be a very difficult undertaking to accomplish. You've seen a lot of progress with the Pakistani government going after Pakistan Taliban, those groups that confront the Pakistani government. But until you see progress on the Afghan Taliban safe havens, you're not going to see real progress here. I think, however, I hope that the military efforts going on right now in Pakistan will presage possibly more of a focus on those Afghan Taliban safe havens.
All right. Karen, do you see any perhaps shift in the U.S. policy in perhaps some of the hints that came out of Barack Obama when he was talking about in his speech about how the U.S. needs to prevent the region being used as a base for al-Qaeda to attack the U.S.? Is there a shift, perhaps, a change in nuance of emphasis from focusing on al-Qaeda rather than the Taliban?
I don't think we know yet. They clearly have recently increased their rhetoric around corruption and needing to tackle those issues with the Karzai government, and that's been a different emphasis than before. And there's been, I think, just by senior officials, there's been much greater discussion about the needs to reform the Karzai government, and they're not just talking about al-Qaeda and the counterterrorism objectives. So they seem to be understanding that in order that there is a larger issue here than al-Qaeda, that it's the Taliban, the concerns about Taliban, and that you have to be addressing the Karzai government and its problems in order to deal with the Taliban. So I think that it seems like the message is getting a little bit more nuanced, and they're emphasizing different kinds of things now than just a military solution and a terrorist threat.
Could that also be problematic in terms of what equals we finished the job?
Well, it's unclear what he means, and I think it's a really good point. We don't know what he's going to say is the ultimate objective and what finishing the job actually means. My guess is that it's not going to be for the Afghan government to have control over every inch of Afghan territory. I don't think that's going to be a realistic objective for the Obama administration. Finishing the job is also not going to mean an Afghan democracy. It's probably going to be something much more minimal, definitely the removal of al-Qaeda. And I don't know how he is exactly going to talk about what finishing the job will mean in terms of Taliban. Will it mean some sort of reconciliation deal, which may not be realistic at this point? Will it mean the destruction of the Taliban entirely, which I don't think is a realistic option? We don't know yet.
Well, it is a complicated, messy situation on the ground, some would argue. Let's take a look at some of those facts on the ground in Afghanistan. Obama's strategy will have to combat, of course, the Taliban insurgency that seems to gain more support each day. It will also have to account for a government that has been accused of being corrupt and weak. And the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, was recently re-elected in a highly controversial vote, as we've been mentioning. Also, the strategy has to counter the illicit drug trade that continues to thrive in Afghanistan. Dawood, you were mentioning perhaps the option of going back to a Grand Loya Jirga, trying to rethink this one out. Would that produce anything different if that was to be repeated, if the Taliban are not included in that process?
Okay. The proposal of a Grand Loya Jirga or a traditional Loya Jirga is as open-ended statement as Mr. Obama's statement that said that we will finish the job. But the danger is that he will probably define the job in a limited way and then leave this country into the hands of the regional players. That danger exists. So we have to be very careful on how we define the job. The Loya Jirga's problem is that the Loya Jirga is defined in the Constitution, and its components are also defined in the Constitution. We do not have all the components of that Loya Jirga. And what I see, the fear is that Mr. Karzai is using these stalling tactics. Right now, in his inaugural speech, he proposed a conference to talk about corruption. I don't know what else can you talk about corruption. Corruption is there, and we have the government of Afghanistan, the judiciary, the prosecutor general, everybody, and all the instruments are there. So all we need to do is put the political will into action and start prosecuting criminals. We don't need a conference or a committee or a commission.
You're an Afghan, though. Do you understand the situation in Afghanistan? Can even Hamid Karzai really change that when he himself is reliant on so many, shall we say, strongmen behind him? I mean, he doesn't really call all the shots, does he?
Well, the strongmen that he tries to portray as strongmen are not as strong as we think they are, because they have been resurrected and they're kept on a life support by Mr. Karzai, and they feed each other. So I think the people of Afghanistan, we should ask, why are the people so frustrated? They're frustrated from these elements, and that's exactly we have to capitalize on. And if we are talking about a Loya Jirga, if it's the Loya Jirga that, if it's the same type of Jirga that produced this kind of election that we saw, then that Loya Jirga would also produce the results that we are not going to look forward to. So we have to be very careful. Initially, we should not allow any delaying tactics. Mr. Karzai has to start delivering. He has been in office for 8 years. We do not need conferences and seminars and committees to start delivery. He has been receiving on-the-job training, and we need to start delivering and then talk about Loya Jirga or anything else later. But we have also, more importantly, more than the Loya Jirga, an important occasion in front of us that gives us this opportunity and a window, which is the parliamentary election. If the parliamentary election is also going to be mired with the same wheelings and dealings and corruption and fraud that the presidential election was mired with, then you can kiss everything goodbye. I don't think anything will work. You will have a parliament that would completely be in the hands of Mr. Karzai, and then the international community will have a very difficult time in getting anything done in this country.
All right, let's go to Michael Cohen. As the discussion seems to be going in the direction of looking for an alternative process. Can that process, political process, is it unthinkable that it might include the Taliban, talking to your enemy?
I certainly think it has to include the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban are obviously a serious political actor in Afghanistan. And I think that you have to separate the core Taliban, who were responsible for housing al-Qaeda pre-9/11, and I think some more of the disaffected Pashtuns represent much of the Taliban militia. I think that's got to be, political reconciliation has to be a huge focus of what this administration is doing. And
Does it seem like we're going in that direction, though, from what we know of this plan so far? It talks about sort of securing major population centers and launching raids and strikes on rural areas.
Well, one of the problems that I see with this plan is that we're trying to go into where the Taliban are the strongest, in the south and the east of the country. We're trying to basically out-governance the Taliban. I don't think that's going to work. I think what the focus really needs to be a regional prioritization. If you look at the north and the west, where the Taliban are much more unpopular, they've been making some inroads. That's where the U.S. counterinsurgency effort has to be focused. Those are the places where the opportunities are the greatest, I think, to establish more legitimacy of the Karzai government. I think in the south and east, at least right now, we've lost the military initiative. We have to get that back. I think that's got to be the focus there, more of a counterterrorism focus with more of a counterinsurgency focus in the north and west. Whether the president does that, I don't know, but I think that should be the focus. I think we're trying to do too much. The notion, as Caroline suggested earlier, that you can do counterinsurgency even with 100,000 troops, I think is a fool's errand. You have to prioritize your efforts here, and I think that's going to be part of what the president says next week.
Caroline, how much of this is sustainable at a time of a massive U.S. deficit?
Well, this is the real problem, because you already have the majority of Americans saying that the war in Afghanistan is not worth it. It's a slight majority, but the majority is there, and you have Congress, especially the Democrats, in revolt, and you see that. That this is building, that the opposition is building. So Obama is going to have a very, very difficult time making the case for an escalation of troop levels. At the same time, though, we've been there 8 years. If Obama can make a clear case with a time frame, he probably will have a flexible time frame with an exit strategy. If he can make the case, have the time frame, and lay out what the implementation plan is going to be with a set of metrics for reaching those goals, and basically say, you know, if we are not making progress, if we're not able to show that that our efforts have gone anywhere in the next year, 2 years, then we will leave. If he needs to make that entire case, and I think people will get behind it if they see that there is a real plan in place with the metrics and with a way out. They will no longer, I believe, support an open-ended commitment to Afghanistan, okay, especially because of our own economic crisis.
All right, we've got about maybe 40 seconds. Quickly get a final comment from Mr. Dawood in Kabul. Very briefly, as perhaps regional powers sit and look at the situation, are they thinking this is going to go the same way as the Soviet experiment in Afghanistan and the void will be filled by us?
I hope that is not the case, and we have to be very careful how to sell this to the American public opinion also. If we tell them that we will leave this country into the hands of two nuclear powers in the region, Pakistan and Iran, then the United States people will understand what the stakes are. So we cannot afford to leave Afghanistan and the so-called job unfinished. The people of Afghanistan are interested in peace and stability, and we have to approach that sentiment, and we have to deliver a government, and this government should not be allowed to be on its own. This is a world community. The entire world is responsible, and this government also has to be responsible to the people of this country and to the international community, and the people of Afghanistan will stand behind that sort of activity and that sort of push.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there now because time, unfortunately, has run out. Let's thank our guests in Kabul, Dawood Sultanzoy, member of the Afghan Parliament; in New York, Michael Cohen from the New America Foundation; and in Washington, D.C., Caroline Wadhams from the Center for American Progress. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.